Hi, we're still searching, and we hope you're still with us. Welcome again to Searching for Answers, where we're working our way now through the fascinating book of Esther in the Old Testament, just before Job. And we're getting into some interesting twists and turns that make this such a classic for reading, for hearing, for telling, and it has its own values for us, yes, many centuries later, still today. Dr. Bernard Taylor, professor of biblical studies, most recently on the pastoral staff at the University, Loma Linda University Church, joined here this evening by Dr. Laura Garrigues, professor of English literature particularly, and chair of that department at La Sierra University. Also Leo Rancelin, another biblical scholar with expertise in both the New Testament and the Old. My name is John Jones. I'm at the Divinity School in La Sierra, and here we go. Grab your Bibles and we'll get right into it. We've been looking particularly at chapter 6, which is rich and has more to say. Where shall we begin? How about the opening verse?
That's a good place. Esther chapter 6 and verse 1. So in chapter 5, we watched Haman go home and recount all his successes, but lament that there was just one fly in his drink, and he wants to get rid of Mordecai, and Jerash, his wife, says, get rid of him. Get rid of him. So that day finally comes to an end with the king and Haman, with Esther, and the promise of the same tomorrow. Chapter 6 and verse 1, the narrator says, on that night the king could not sleep. And I just find it remarkable that as it comes time to go to bed, the king can't sleep. Why do we care about the king? Because the king had the surprise call from Esther. She has something on his mind. He doesn't know what it is. Now, if he could, he'd turn the television on. There's no television. So in the absence of television, you have somebody reading the records of the past. And reading for a lot of people is a way to go to sleep, especially something like that, but it wakes him up and has interesting consequences as it unfolds. So I find it remarkable that this story pauses long enough about Mordecai. Mordecai wants to be king. Mordecai comes first.
Haman wants to be king.
Haman wants to be king. My mistake. And now it turns the other way.
Yeah.
Ahasuerus can't sleep.
You know, it's interesting. Children's telling of this story often connects the building of the gallows to the fact that the king cannot sleep. The banging of the hammer keeps the king awake that night. That connection is often drawn in children's stories. And to a certain extent, you could support it by the fact that later the indication is that from the palace you can see the gallows. So the idea is not too far-fetched that maybe it was noisy enough. But I really like your suggestion that maybe he's awake thinking about what is it that's on Esther's mind. I think that's very interesting.
The other thing I think we need to highlight here in the beginning is all of a sudden, the king has a sleepless night, and all of a sudden he finds in the royal annals the name of Mordecai, who was unrewarded for this good deed that he did towards the king. And then we certainly need some counsel and advice as to how we might want to honor Mordecai. All of a sudden, Haman is in the court, right? And he asks him for advice, and the story continues to develop. And so we've got three incredible coincidences. We've got some silences there, because when the king talks to Haman, doesn't say who he's thinking of honoring. And so off Haman goes. It all just beautifully fits in a manner that begins the reversal to bring Haman down and bring about the deliverance of the Jewish people. And so I read that and I just wonder, coincidence or divine providence at work?
Right.
Which is it, right?
And as the story unfolds, it would be easy to put on television. Here is a monitor, and Haman just walks past the camera, and
Right.
he's seen,
Right.
which is another way of saying, what level of security did they have to know that Haman was within the precincts of the palace, that he was there? I guess there were guards, and nobody had to go and look. They knew that Haman had just come in.
Right.
But in terms of this question of providence, that of course keeps arising, because on the one hand, God is never mentioned in the Hebrew text, but on the other hand, the alternative appears to be blind fate, but that is way too gauche for this sort of story, because it is so subtly told that one must be listening, and one must listen to the presence of God who is felt there, even though it's not told as forthrightly as it would if it was an Israelite, or or the Jerusalem court or something like that. But it never gets away from it, and it nags at the corner of the mind of the reader. Wow, what a fluke! Well, this is happening too much here.
Right.
Right.
There is a different level of story, which leaves me with my overarching question. Isn't it fascinating that we have such sensitive storytelling when we think we invented storytelling thousands of years later? This is so rewarding. It can be so carefully studied.
That's true. It's interesting. I think the idea that these silences, these seeming coincidences, are really the fingerprint of God in the story, and yet that fingerprint of God is worked through the characters themselves. If Haman wasn't so eager to kill Mordecai, he wouldn't have been at the court that early in the day to be the one that's seen. If the king, let's say the Chronicles had read the particular Mordecai thing, what if we allowed a couple of coincidences to be there? But if instead of Haman being there early in the morning to make his request for the death of Mordecai, some other courtier had been called in by the king to say, hey, what should I do for the man that I want to honor? The story would have gone another way.
Right.
But it's that emotion, that anger, that hate that drives him early in the morning, in a sense in the middle of the night still, to be at the court, that makes the hand of God pushing this story. It's enabled through, ironically, the hate of Haman himself.
Yeah.
His own undoing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Now,
just to underscore one last, this is such an important point for me, because I see the fingerprints of God here, the hidden hand of God working through envy, through treachery, through arrogance. Somehow, some way, Israel's election just jumps out at me here, and the ultimate deliverance of the people of God is beginning to come to fruition here. So I do see that, and brings comfort to me to know that sometimes in particular events that I may go through, even though they can be unseemly events that I'm a part of, somehow, some way, the fingerprints of God can be present in those events, bringing about his redemptive purposes.
Absolutely. Even in the darkest and most evil of circumstances, God's power can bring good out of it.
yeah, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong, it seems, forever on the throne, and yet that scaffold does sway the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God, albeit unnamed, standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. Interesting.
Interesting where the next paragraph.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
So, 6:1, on that night, the king could not sleep. Mordecai can't sleep. He's having the gallows built.
Haman.
So Haman is having the gallows built. I'll hang on to myself in the end here. And then verse 12.
Yeah. Yeah.
All that Mordecai has been through, led by Haman. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. What an incredible line. He didn't need to rush off and tell anybody. That was nice. That was nice. Now let's get back to work. He just goes back to the gate. There's a man who is unaffected.
Didn't go to his head, is your point.
Appreciative, but it doesn't define him. He can go right back to work.
I think you're right. The brevity and specificity of that line is contrasted by what follows, where Haman hurries home, mourning, ash on his head. You know, that whole reversal of clothing, where Mordecai had been in mourning and was put in the king's robe during the triumph. And here we have Haman, used to being in robes. Well, he puts something over his head to indicate his mourning. So there's a change of costuming that's indicating the change of faith, that turning of the wheel.
It says a lot, doesn't it? Yeah.
In a short, detailed kind of way, which is often where the Bible's literary quality is seen. It's in the well-chosen word in the right place, not a lot of fluff and excess, and I think this is a good example.
One other example in this very chapter is when the king tells Haman, quickly take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai. He appears to be unaware of this edict that he's authorized Haman to bring into being. Right?
That's a
he
good
does not
point.
know that. So, from what appears from the story.
That's interesting.
There's a lot that gets past this king.
Yeah.
He is not a detail-oriented kind of guy.
You take the signet ring and write whatever.
Yeah, whatever you want. That's okay. Yeah.
Just don't bother me. Yeah.
Very true.
You're right about the details.
Indeed, in those two scenes that we saw before of Mordecai's exaltation, in neither does he look particularly arrogant. You notice that he's not sort of strutting. You know, he's there on that horse because he has to be, but he's not slumping. But he is not somehow looking at the people around him and lording it over them. And you're quite right. He gets off that horse and simply goes back to the gate again. Isn't that interesting? Yeah? Matter of fact. There's something matter of fact about that, isn't there?
Yes.
The narrator doesn't tell us anything about his inner life and his experience.
Right.
I would love to, this is great, this is awesome, nothing.
And so
There's just your one phrase.
Right. And the implication is what you see on the outside is what you get on the inside then. Whereas with Haman, sometimes that's different.
Now we get a picture of his inner
Where
life.
when he, now in Haman's thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So it becomes a completely selfish act. The king has asked him for advice, what shall I do? And Haman makes it totally about himself. And we know that because of the interior information the narrator gives us, in contrast to what you've said about Mordecai. He is what you see.
Mordecai is transparent.
Right.
Haman is duplicitous.
Right.
So you have to, somebody has to take you inside to know what's happening.
That's right.
Good point.
So here we are, verse 12, chapter 6. Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Oh dear. When Haman told his wife, he is not a man who keeps his feelings when he's at home, hidden. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends, here we are with the friends again,
Right.
everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, well, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has already begun, you're sliding now. If he's of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And I can hear a Jewish audience saying, amen, hearing this. If he's of the Jewish people, he cannot prevail. Yes. Among the Jewish people, we can hear that response.
And some have argued that that is the central point of this whole story. the fact that the Jewish people cannot, under any circumstances, be exterminated.
Yeah.
They will not
Yeah.
be destroyed because they are the elect people of God. And of course, we're going to have a festival that's going to celebrate that deliverance at the end.
Yeah.
And I kind of agree. I think that may well be the central point of the story. God's divine protection of his people. My question here is, how does Zeresh know that?
Right, right.
How does she know that?
No, that is
'Cause it's
interesting.
there.
And if she can see it, why can't Haman?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, it is her voice we're listening to, not the narrators.
It's a
Yeah.
quote. It's a direct
Yes.
quote of her.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And it's an interesting contrast to the previous discussions that we heard in chapter 5 going on in Haman's
Yes.
home, where he gives the catalog of all his riches. This is like part 2 of that conversation, and it's the absolute reverse. We don't even need the catalog repeated here. We remember it. And she's pointing out, you're on the slide. You're on the way down now. And yet he desperately keeps fighting it.
The other thing I'm struck with up now through chapter 6 is that premise flowing through, it seems to me, the entire book is this moral system that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. Right? It just, inappropriate, sinful, wicked acts do have consequences, and this story, in a graphic way, brings that to light.
Right.
Whereas those who are faithful and committed, like Esther and Mordecai, to God, prosper. So I think there's a moral system running through here of justice that gets underscored, seems to me.
And yet it's justice sometimes delayed.
Right.
Yeah.
That,
The mills of the gods do grind slowly, but they
Right,
grind
but they-
exceeding fine.
right.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
and the victors at the end, you know, a few chapters later, when Mordecai and Queen Esther have some power, do some, in my estimation, inappropriate things with
Right.
that power. They get a bit vindictive. But,
Right.
yeah.
There may be some stereotyping going on here in the words of Zeresh.
Okay.
When we get to chapter 9, we're going to be told that everyone, many people rise up against the Jews. They're characterized not as one person, but in whole groups as enemies of the Jews. And the fear of the Lord falls upon all the people. The fear of the Jews, not of the Lord, of the Jews falls upon all people. Which maybe means that there is also part of the stereotype is those Jews, they're really different from us, but don't get crosswise with them because you can't win.
Right.
And that may be part of what his wife is saying, is reflecting this popular notion of the day. Yeah, there are people who do not wish the Jewish people well, apparently. And this edict is going to take hold. It's going to meet welcome on the part of some people, a positive response. Oh yes, at last we can get these Jews out of here. Personally, I have to wonder, after Cyrus, already years earlier, has issued that decree saying, you know, you Jewish people, you can go back home now anytime you want, please. You almost wonder about that, don't you? It may well be that Egypt, increasingly threatening the Mesopotamian kingdoms, and having a resurgent Judea right back in the homeland again and prospering, not only will allow the Jews, provide for the Jews to pay better taxes without competing with the people in Nineveh, Babylon, but may also serve as a buffer state between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And it might be that Cyrus was not merely saying, you may go home if you wish, we'd like to kind of gently encourage you that direction. And maybe this whole edict of a pogrom against the Jews may have been following on, albeit many years later now, to kind of say, why don't we finally rid our country, Babylon, of these Jewish people and to give them reason to go home. That may have been part of the undercurrent. I'm reading between the lines here, obviously, but one has to wonder a little, you know.
I'd like to read between the lines a little bit too, and going back to your question about Zeresh and the wise men. How do they see what's coming? And we've been talking about this as a kind of triumphant book for the Jews and something about them as special people. And yet there is a thread throughout the Old Testament sort of leading to the New Testament about truth being known to people other than the Jews. And sometimes it's through kind of crooked, sideways kind of directions, but sometimes they've got the knowledge of God in some way or another. So Zeresh, she sees the truth. She's absolutely right. We don't know if part of that is a kind of revelation from God, if it's meant to be kind of falling into that Orientalist sort of stereotype that maybe she has some sort of special second knowledge. I mean, there's several ways that maybe different audiences would read her. But I do find it fascinating that from whatever mechanism, truth is told to Haman early on at a time when he could have turned around and changed. Maybe, right? He had the word, you're going to fall if you keep going. But he didn't hear it, and he did. So she's one of a kind of long line of others outside of Judaism that from whatever mechanism sort of have the truth and speak it, even if they don't realize the value maybe, or the source of it.
It certainly sets up in the Gospels a niche for those wise men from the East, doesn't it? Who somehow seem to know better than the people in Judea.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Zeresh comes on the scene after the edict that Haman facilitated with the king. It makes me wonder if Zeresh had gotten a hold of Haman and says, you want to do what against the Jewish people? Are you kidding me?
Right.
That's not astute and smart.
Right.
But she doesn't come on the scene before, but after that edict. The other thing here, here's another example to me as to there's these Old Testament themes percolating through these texts in a kind of hidden, not hidden, but implied manner. I just can't help but think of Israel's election, Genesis chapter 12. God chooses of all the ancient Near Eastern peoples, he chooses Abraham and his offspring to be his people to bless all nations. And I just see that here being alluded to, playing through this story. So even though it has these secularistic impulses, no references to God, religious practices, there are elements in the story that just bring to light other pieces of the canon, for me.
It's a sophisticated text that anticipates sophisticated hearers in a way, isn't it?
And it may suggest that for faithful people who live in a foreign land, there's different ways of expressing your faith and living out obedience to God. That flexibility and adaptability is
So do
good
we
qualities to
have?
Right?
Right. So do we have a literary, the fancy word is genre, a type of literature here that says, we Jews, despised among so many nations, when we wind up living among them, Joseph in Egypt, Daniel in Babylon, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it turns out that, as in Lake Wobegon, all our children are above average, Not only are they wiser than the wise men, they can interpret dreams and so forth, they're more clever,
more beautiful.
they're better looking, Esther, but also Daniel and his companions, they even look better than these viziers, these magicians, we can beat them at their own game when we get the chance. Is that part of the undercurrent of the message in the Joseph cycle, in Daniel, in here? Could it be?
I think so.
And how would the story function then, as it's told among Jewish people in ancient time, but many generations after it's the setting of the story, and even in modern times?
In a way, it might reduce the tension of the story. Because they'd say, hey, after all, these are Jews in a foreign land. It's going to end well for them, don't worry. Even as the story tries to build that plot in. If it's part of this genre, of this cycle, and the hearers are used to it, it gives comfort that would tend to reduce the tension and the danger in it.
Yeah. woven through somehow.
Yeah, I think that as we move towards New Testament times and Judaism spreads through the diaspora, times of persecution and so on, to have a festival from out there, a non-Palestinian festival, and to have a story about living and surviving out there, doing things that we would never have condoned before, but do work out, and God in his own way, through providence, there's maybe a sensitivity to the feelings of people out there. This story is told in this fashion, which is affirming, encouraging, and offers a way into the future.
Yeah.
And I know I would be encouraged in that sort of setting at that sort of time to have a way forward into the future that because there are those who have despised those who left either voluntarily or by force and were no longer living in Palestine. They're not really Jewish. The anticipation of the Maccabees that when they went out somewhere they'd lose the faith. They built synagogues. They kept the Christian church and also Judaism alive by coming back to the festivals, spending the money that they had. Tourism, shekel kept them alive and doing very well. And Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles went from synagogue to synagogue. It was all part of the future. And this is part of the creation of that world and creating a space where one could live.
But wow, the ground has really shifted under their feet for that new perspective. Stories like this are somehow an answer, I think, to that heartbroken cry in the Psalms. How can I sing the songs of Zion in a strange land? People come and tease us and say, chant your chants, but I just feel like hanging my harp up on a tree branch and weeping by the riverside. That's all I'm good for anymore. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's another path that's beginning to emerge here somehow. Yeah?
Yeah.
And of course, as you say, it does lay the foundation for the Gospels, doesn't it, in an unanticipated way. Yeah.
A very brief point at the end, the last verse of chapter 6. I love how it says, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came. So we have this quote from Zeresh. And as I sort of pictured the Secret Service agents coming and picking up the president and taking him.
And hustling them away.
The action moves forward.
So here we are. The action will indeed continue next time, so we invite you to catch us again next time on Searching for Answers.